Practices don't fail. Agile does not fail. XP doesn't fail. Scrum does not fail. Not even waterfall fails or can fail. These are just a set of practices and ideas that fit a specific context and grew out of a specific context. We fail. And what we fail to do is understand our current context and the current culture we're looking to apply those practices in. For years, I managed a saltwater fish tank. It was an all-consuming hobby. And what took the majority of the time was not the fish, was not the casing, was not the tank itself. What took the majority of time was to manage the single most important thing that dictated whether the tank would succeed or fail, whether I can have a very rare and sensitive fish or an anemone or a clam. That one thing was the one thing I could not see or you cannot see, which is the water. If you want a successful tank that can house the most beautiful fish and really create beauty, it all comes down to managing the thing you cannot see, the water. And cultures and organizations are the same. In order to have a company, an organization that's capable of creating beauty, whether it's in products or in an environment or services, you have to manage the one thing you cannot see, which is culture. That's the point of this video. And there's 3 things I want to cover. The first thing is all about learning to see the invisible or the culture so that you can actually change the visible. Edgar Schein, an organizational psychologist out of MIT and one of the preeminent thinkers in organizational culture, says that in order to change an organization, you must first understand its culture and then work within it to transform it. Imagine how many times we introduce practices without first understanding the culture and then saying the practices fail. Let's start by defining culture. My definition is the ingrained behaviors of the organization that grew out of good times and bad. In my experience, it's usually the things that grew out of bad times that manifest itself in the culture. But Deal and Kennedy have a much more succinct definition of culture, which is the way things get done around here. A useful model to think about culture is Edgar Schein's model. And he has a 3-step model, which is basically think of it like a pyramid, which are the artifacts that you see. If you think of a pyramid or an iceberg, what everyone sees. It can be the open office layouts, the innovation lab and hackathons, the Spotify model. These artifacts, or what he calls artifacts, are generally what's copied from company to company. So you have a successful company, what you can see, the visible, are the artifacts, and those are the things that get copied. In the case of Spotify, what made the Spotify model so visible and so famous and so popular was Henrik Nieberg's video of the Spotify model. And Spotify itself being the biggest music company in the world, successful, profitable, so other companies started copying the artifacts. This is the easiest thing to do and generally the most useless or the most harmful thing you can do. The second aspect of a culture, according to Edgar Schein, is what the company says about themselves, what their espoused values are, right? And I found it really fascinating that Enron's espoused values, one of the most unethical companies of the last century, their espoused values are integrity, communication, respect, and excellence. And while they are really excellent at being not very ethical, but other than that, that's their espoused values. But at the base of the pyramid, or really what's below the surface, is what the company believes about itself, the basic assumptions. And this is what's really hard to see, what they actually value. So in the case of Enron, they might say integrity, communication, but what they value above all else is profit at all costs. And it's really fascinating. Companies have their own value systems. And there's like a brief story I want to say here. I have my own personal value systems. And I used to always be at odds with one of the companies I worked for. It just felt wrong. And I felt I needed to bend the values or bend the will of the organizations to meet my own personal value, which is an exercise in futility and stupidity. I am not going to change a 100-year-old company with deep underlying assumptions and values with my values. It's my job to leave. Right? I'm not going to change the values of the company, and I wasn't willing to sacrifice my own values. So, according to Edgar Sheen, you have 3 levels, and I think this is a very useful way of thinking about cultures, which is what you can see, what the company or organization says about itself, but genuinely what they believe. And there's another thing here that I'd like to say is that the Agile Manifesto, I mean the actual values part, not the part no one reads, the principles part. The values part, if you forget about the actual 4 values, think about how it starts. Nobody really focuses on that. What they start is, we have come to value. This is the value system of the value statement of those 18 people. But what if their value system and what they have come to value is not in line with what the company that you're looking to install agile values? What if they value something completely different? What if they value the exact opposite? So you're putting a set of frameworks or ideas in a culture that values something completely different. And so it's really important to understand the dissonance between the values that created something and the value in the place that you're trying to put it in. So you really, in order to change it, you need to uncover and understand the basic assumptions, really what the company believes or values, or what I think is the genuine culture of that organization. The next thing I want to cover is something near and dear to my heart, which is this idea of cultural institutification. So the idea of institutification comes from Cory Doctorow. He's a writer and a thinker and a generally awesome person. But basically, the notion of institutification comes from products degrading over time. So products basically suck over time. Why? Because the company starts prioritizing profits over the user. A great example of that is Google search. You search something in Google, and now all you get is a bunch of ads. And you have to scroll through the ads until you get to the result. It's almost unusable now. Why? Because they're prioritizing profit over the user itself or the user experience. And so Google is losing market share. That's product institutification, or what Cory Doctorow calls institutification. I also believe the same thing applies to cultures. If you're not really careful, you get cultural institutification, and they degrade over time for various reasons. And if they're not actively managed, this accelerates. Just to end this idea of why it's so important to understand cultures and to manage culture, Simon Sinek says, transformation happens not by chance, but by choice. And the choice is informed by deep cultural awareness. This idea of deep cultural awareness is probably one of the reasons I've been so successful over the years in working with banks and transforming banks. I used to think it was because I'm so clever or had great hair. It has nothing to do with any of that stuff. The real reason I've been successful in helping transform banks is I grew up in banks. I started working in banks since I was 18 years old. I worked in New York, I worked in London, I worked in the Middle East, I worked in various cities in the US. I worked in the front office, back office, middle office. I worked in treasury, I worked in payments, I worked in the commercial bank, I worked in the investment bank, I worked across different products. All this to say, I really understand and grok the culture of the organization. I understand the culture, I understand the levers, I know how to speak farm, which is another way I know how to speak the language. My deep understanding of the culture, the levers, is what helped me navigate and help this organization change. Now, what I'm not saying is that you need to be in a company for 20 years or 25 years or since you're 18, but you have to consciously take the time to understand the culture before you attempt to change it. So if surfacing the actual culture, what Edgar Sheen says as the underlying assumptions or values is so critical to change it, and you haven't been there for 20 or 25 years, how do you surface the real culture? And to me, one of the greatest levers and ways of doing that is through the stories, or through stories that are told. What do I mean by that? Stories act as a cultural reservoir, carrying values, emotions, and lessons that shape an organizational identity and influence its actions. In other words, stories are the currency of culture. They're what dictate what the culture is, how the culture is transformed, how the culture is transferred from person to person. Think about a new hire. A new hire joins a company. Think about all the stories they hear. So they're given a packet and some welcome information and some videos to watch. And then they hear from people above them in the company, people who have been there for 30 years. What are the stories that person is going to hear? Recently, I was in a company and someone told me a story, which is things never change here. This is where we come to retire. Now, that one story transfers so much information. And imagine that story is told to a new hire. The power of stories are incredible and cannot be understated. Stories are not the only ways to understand the culture, but they're a powerful way to understand the culture. So, what are the types of stories that are told? There are generally four. The stories the organization tells the world, and that can come in quarterly reports and come in press releases. This is when you put your best foot forward. Then the stories are said about the organization from external sources. The stories are said about the organization. Then there are the internal stories that are told to the outside world. And you can find them in Glassdoor or Reddit. Like recently, I wanted to really understand the culture of a company that I was consulting with. So I went to Google's new model deep research and I said, give me all of the actual values and culture of the company based on what's said in Glassdoor, Reddit, and other public sites. So these are company insiders talking to the outside world about the company. And in this case, a healthcare company, the values that they were espousing on their website, or what Edgar Sheen says, what they say, were diametrically opposed to the values, the underlying assumptions, the actual culture. And then the fourth type of story is the stories that are said inside of the organization. The stories that are said by the water cooler, the stories that are said to the new grad, the stories that are said from senior managers to junior managers, from developers, all of those network of stories. And that is what I think is the most interesting. Because think about it, if you have a lot of negative stories, you definitely want to surface them and deal with them before they go to Reddit or Glassdoor or Whistleblower or they're told to the outside world. So it's all about, for me, capturing the stories that are said inside of the org. But how do you do that? Do you go around and just sit there by water coolers and just hear what people are going to say? It's that would be inefficient, albeit very hydrating. No, I found a particular tool to accelerate that, to accelerate the story gathering process. And it can be a little controversial, but this is how I do it, and hopefully find it useful. So the first thing is, I create a simple format called behavior stories, stories that describe behavior. And the template is very simple. In order to achieve a goal, because everyone has a goal, whether they're OKRs or yearly goals, quarterly goals, everyone has a goal. The format is, in order to achieve the goals, X person, role, or entity must stop doing Y behavior. It's very simple. In order to achieve the goal, X person, group, entity, can be internal, external, can be a person, it can be a group, must stop doing Y behavior. It's all negative. I'm not introducing any positive thing here. These are all negative stories, which is why I call them behavior stories, or BS for short. It's all about getting rid of the BS. And to accelerate this further, I do this in a workshop setting. So if I'm in a group, or if I'm invited into a division or a company, I will schedule what I call the BS workshop. I'll have all their goals, and I'll have everyone write on a note card, in order to achieve these goals, X person must stop doing Y behavior. Now, there's going to be a lot of stuff coming to your mind. Where I'm not. This whole video is not about BS, and I can talk about it in future videos. But trust me, once somebody starts writing, everybody starts writing, and within an hour, you can have hundreds of behavior stories. And when clustered, it will give you a very close approximation to the underlying assumptions or the real culture of the organization. I remember doing it in a bank, and after clustering all the information and looking at it, I asked the room, "What do you think?" And someone just said, "I've never seen our actual culture on the wall before." And the irony and the interesting thing is, behind the glass wall was their espoused values engraved in marble on the wall. And it was just a poetic and ironic juxtaposition between the reality and what the company tells itself and tells the world. The final thing I want to talk about is the actual change part, the change to the better, the happy ending. You need to change the stories to change the organization. And Brene Brown has a quote that I love, which is, "When we listen and learn from the culture, we build trust and pave the way for true transformation." This quote applies on so many levels and means a lot to me personally in the way I do things. I just came back from Egypt 2 weeks ago in an industry that's very different from my own, manufacturing of medical devices, the furthest thing from my own experience. But the amount of time I took to understand the culture, the context, the culture of the organization, but even beyond that, the culture of the country itself and how business is done in that culture, the nuanced use of humor to communicate lots of ideas loaded and unloaded, went so much to build the credibility with the organization. And one of the feedbacks I heard was, "We love the fact that you made no suggestions until you truly tried to understand us." And so understanding the culture is not just limited to the maladaptive practices within the company itself. So again, these are all the prerequisites to change the story, which is the point of all of this. It's all about changing those stories. And there's 2 stories I want to highlight. The first is Boeing. Boeing, in the early 90s, there was a statement that was said and it became ubiquitous. "If it ain't Boeing, I ain't going." Because Boeing was known for quality and it was known for innovation. This story has changed entirely post the merger to, "If it's Boeing, I ain't going." Now, not only has this story negatively impacted the culture, it's also led to death. And so, without properly managing the culture, you can truly destroy the company. And it's taking years now to rebuild from this story. A more positive story is Microsoft and Satya, who, in my opinion, doesn't get enough credit. Satya, when he took over, one of the things that he had going for him is that he deeply understood the culture of Microsoft. He came from Microsoft, he grew up in Microsoft before he was made the CEO. So similar to me in banking, he understood the culture. And one of the major shifts, one of the major stories that he wanted to change was going from a know-it-all culture, we know it all, to a learn-it-all culture. Another one was going from a fragmented Microsoft to one Microsoft. And as far as the shareholders are concerned, he's incredibly successful because he took the company from $300 billion to now $3 trillion. It went from a boring has-been company that was on its way to be the new IBM to an interesting and innovative company. Now, this is where the practices actually come in. And notice how I began. Practices don't fail. And notice how I'm ending. I'm ending now with the practices. After this entire journey of understanding the culture, understanding the story, understanding how we're trying to shift the stories. Once you fundamentally understand the story you're trying to shift, this is where you apply the practices. You don't begin with them, you actually end with them. So in the case of Satya, he's changed a bunch of things structurally. He's introduced new practices. One of them is abolishing the 360 so that people are not compared against other people. And this was all about changing the story from a fragmented Microsoft to one Microsoft. So again, you almost end with the selection of the practices. Juxtapose that with what's happening today, which is we start by introducing the practices and later we say the practice itself failed. Again, the practices don't fail, we fail. And the final thing, going back to the fish tank, is that all this stuff takes time. Managing the water in the fish tank takes time. Trying to improve the water takes weeks. Trying to solve a problem once the water starts degrading takes weeks, if not months. All of this stuff takes time. And a lot of times when my clients ask me, how long is this going to take? Well, I said, how long did it take to get here? How long did this cultural enshittification take? It's going to take at least half that time to get it to where you want. So this takes time, but in my opinion, nothing is more important for a leader, a coach, a change agent to focus on other than the culture and changing the stories. So that's it. I hope you found that interesting. This was not meant to be an exhaustive talk on culture, but just introducing the idea and reorient and change your mental models around the role of culture and practices. That to start with culture and not to start with practices. And to understand that culture is generally communicated through stories. And you really want to develop techniques to uncover those stories. I develop behavior stories. And if you want more information on that, go to my website, zone2consulting.com, and schedule 30 minutes with me if you'd like to talk.